So the brain is terribly simple. It's made up of 4 cells, and 2 of them are shown here. There's the nerve cell, and then there's the myelinating cell, or the insulating cell. It's called oligodendrocyte. And when these 4 cells work together in health, in harmony, they create an extraordinary symphony of electrical activity. And it is this electrical activity that underpins our ability to think, to emote, to remember, to learn, move, feel, and so on. But equally, each of these individual 4 cells, alone or together, can go rogue or die. And when that happens, you get damaged wiring, you get disrupted connections. And that's evident here with the slower conduction. But ultimately, this damage will manifest as disease, clearly. And if the starting dying nerve cell is a motor nerve, for example, you'll get motor neuron disease. So I'd like to give you a real-life illustration of what happens with motor neuron disease. So this is a patient of mine called John. So John I saw just last week in the clinic, and I've asked John to tell us something about what were his problems that led to the initial diagnosis of motor neuron disease.
I was diagnosed in October 2011, and the main problem was a breathing problem, difficulty breathing.
I don't know if you caught all of that, but what John was telling us was that difficulty with breathing led eventually to the diagnosis of motor neuron disease. So John's now 18 months further down in that journey, and I've now asked him to tell us something about his current predicament.
What I've got now is the breathing's got worse. I've got weakness in my hands, my arms, and my legs. So basically, I'm in a wheelchair most of the time.
So John's just told us he's in a wheelchair most of the time. So what these 2 clips show is not just the devastating consequence of the disease, but they also tell us something about the shocking pace of the disease. Because in just 18 months, a fit adult man has been rendered wheelchair and respirator dependent. And let's face it, John could be anybody's father, brother, or friend. So that's what happens when the motor nerve dies. But what happens when that myelin cell dies? You get multiple sclerosis. So the scan on your left is an illustration of the brain, and it's a map of the connections of the brain, and superimposed upon which are areas of damage. We call them lesions of demyelination, but they're damage, and they're white. Well, you know what? I think there is hope. And there's hope in this next section of this brain section of somebody else with MS, because what it illustrates is, amazingly, the brain can repair itself. It just doesn't do it well enough. And so again, there are 2 things I want to show you. First of all is the damage of this patient with MS, and again, it's another one of these white masses. But crucially, the area that's ringed red highlights an area that is pale blue. But that area that is pale blue was once white, so it was damaged, it's now repaired. Just to be clear, it's not because of doctors, it's in spite of doctors, not because of doctors. This is spontaneous repair. It's amazing, and it's occurred because there are stem cells in the brain even, which can enable new myelin, new insulation to be laid down over the damaged nerves. And this observation is important for 2 reasons. The first is it challenges one of the orthodoxies that we learnt at medical school, or at least I did, admittedly last century, which is that the brain doesn't repair itself, unlike, say, the bone or the liver. But actually it does, but it just doesn't do it well enough. And the second thing it does, it gives us a very clear direction of travel for new therapies. I mean, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to know what to do here. You simply need to find ways of promoting the endogenous spontaneous repair that occurs anyway. And of course, absolutely we can. We can use stem cells, and specifically we can use human stem cells. And human stem cells are these extraordinary but simple cells that can do 2 things. They can self-renew or make more of themselves, but they can also become specialized to make bone, liver, but crucially nerve cells, maybe even the motor nerve cell or the myelin cell. And the challenge has long been, can we harness the power, the undoubted power of these stem cells in order to realize their promise for regenerative neurology? And I think we can now. And the reason we can is because there have been several major discoveries in the last 10, 20 years. Drug discovery in a dish is how people often talk about this. It's very simple. You take a patient with a disease, let's say motor neuron disease, you take a skin sample, you do the pluripotent reprogramming, as I've already told you, and you generate live motor nerve cells. That's straightforward, because that's what pluripotent cells can do. But crucially, you can then compare their behavior to their equivalent but healthy counterparts, ideally from an unaffected relative. That way you're matching for genetic variation. And that's exactly what we did here. This was a collaboration with colleagues in London, Chris Shaw, and the US, Steve Finkbein and Tom Meniatis. And what you're looking at, and this is amazing, these are living, growing motor nerve cells from a patient with motor neuron disease. Happens to be an inherited form. I mean, just imagine that. This would have been unimaginable 10 years ago. So apart from seeing them grow and put out processes, we can also engineer them so that they fluoresce. But crucially, we can then track their individual health and compare the diseased motor nerve cells to the healthy ones.